speakers. Just to let you know that some of the webinar will be recorded. So a little bit then around webinars. I suppose I'm more used to attending webinars than actually being front of house at a webinar, so it's not as relaxing for me as it might usually be. You're on mute, all of you who are attending are on mute, and your cameras are off, so you can sit back and relax, and hopefully you'll have a very informative and learning afternoon with the really interesting speakers we have lined up. There is, at the end of your screen, you will see that there is a chat box and question and answers. So we'll hold the question and answers for the end of the session. Please send them in as you have them, and we'll share them with the panelists at the very end. So just to start off then on my presentation. Here we go. So we're all here and we've gone through that. Just to give you an overview here of the agenda. So I'll just briefly give you an overview of the Limerick Network on Violence Against Women. Then we'll have Luke Hart giving an input around, Luke is a domestic abuse advocate, around the insidious nature of coercive control. We have Michelle Walsh from Rape Crisis Network Ireland. She'll speak about the launch of a report, an exploration of sexual harassment among Irish adolescents, experience and understanding. And then we'll have Lisa Marmion, and I want to give a special thank you for Lisa, who's come in at short notice to replace Mary McDermott. Lisa's the Services Development Manager with Safe Ireland, and she's going to talk around coercive control and woman's journey. And Inspector Marion Cusack from An Garda Síochána will finish up then with what a woman can expect if she contacts the Gardaí, and then we'll have our question and answers. So the Limerick Area Network on Violence Against Women is hosting today's event, and we're a collaborative group. We bring together lots of different organisations, community and voluntary, statutory, frontline services. We came together initially towards the end of the 1990s, and it was then a statutory instrument. We were set up as part of the regional advisory committees, which were set up in regions throughout Ireland, and we were a local network set up under that structure. While the statutory nature is now defunct, we continued to meet as a local network because we felt there was still a purpose in us meeting, sharing information, offering each other support, and generally trying to improve circumstances for women so that they could be safe. Our vision is a society where women are safe from violence, and perpetrators of such violence will be held accountable. And we share information, we support training and awareness, we identify and highlight issues, and offer peer-to-peer support. And that's where today has come from. We try to learn ourselves all of the time. And I suppose one of the joys of webinars is that we can share that learning with a wider audience very easily. So we're very pleased that we can learn more ourselves and share it with everybody else as well. Now I'm very pleased to hand over to Dr. Michelle Walsh, who is with Rape Crisis Network Ireland. Michelle holds a master's degree in clinical supervision and is a fully accredited psychotherapist and clinical supervisor. She has also worked on the Real You project, delivering training on the module Sex and the Law, in addition to delivering trainings to a wide variety of audiences on sexual violence and consent. Michelle works for Rape Crisis Midwest as a counsellor, trainer, and as a former board member. She has also trained support workers for the Sexual Assault Treatment Unit. Michelle is both knowledgeable and passionate around sexual, domestic and gender-based violence, doing anything she can to prevent it. So I welcome you, Michelle, and looking forward to hearing your input.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks very much. And I'm delighted to be here and talk to you about some research that I've been doing lately into sexual abuse and domestic violence, I suppose, in adolescence. So I have a bit of a PowerPoint and I'm going to put that on and share it for you now. But beforehand, I suppose what I'd really like to do is to give the research a little bit of a background. And I think it's very, very easy to look at stats and figures around domestic violence and sexual abuse without actually giving it a human face. And I think that we need to always keep that to the forefront. So I've worked in domestic violence and sexual abuse for a good number of years, maybe 10, 15 at this stage. And I suppose in recent years, I've discovered that things like we're getting progressively better at looking at what's going on. We've got definitions of consent. We have consent legislation that's come in, where, you know, the active consent program in NUI, looking at what's happening in third level institutions and within our Irish adult population. But what it doesn't tell us is what's going on underneath. And I don't think any of us for 1 minute believe that you just wake up one morning, you hit adulthood, and you suddenly become a victim of sexual violence. So I decided to look beneath what I knew was going on, or what I thought was going on, and actually get a clearer picture. And on one of the first days of collecting research, one of the participants, so I collected research from 600 Irish adolescents between the ages of 13 and 17. And one of them, on the first days of collecting developed a questionnaire, and I interviewed 100 of them. But one of the girls gave me a poem, and I'm just going to read that to you before I share the stats with you. So I was sexually assaulted when I was 6 years old. Until very recently, I thought nothing of it. Everyone has a weird cousin, right? Crazy inside jokes. Just between you guys. A family. It happens to everyone. Who was I to know that my experiences were anything more than that? Every secret meeting was backed up with giggles and jokes and touches and tickles, and we were the best of friends. He made me feel special, like I was his little girl, and I cherished that feeling. I've spent the last decade searching for that feeling, begging to feel wanted, through self-harm, through binge eating, through sex. Yet here we are, basking in the emptiness of what I've come to accept as reality. I can remember so vividly encounters I had with him. Let's go play a game behind the turf shed. So like a dog, I patted obediently behind him, giggling. I was his favourite, you see, and that's all that mattered. My experience with sexual abuse is something I'm still only coming to terms with. Something I want to brush under the rug and forget about, but I can't. Sexual assault isn't always touching. It's a memory, a psychological mark that is relentless in its presence. A strange thing I've come to notice about myself over the last week or so is how I was so unaware until I wasn't anymore. He never left a mark on my body. He only scarred my mind. It's like I always thought that scar was a birthmark, and now I can't look at it the same way, and I never will. We all go on a journey of self-acceptance. For some, a brisk stroll through a park, occasionally tarnished by thorns. For others, a boat ride through a storm, each wave of emotion crashing through you on what seems like a never-ending quest for stability. But we all get there in the end. Though each journey is unique, each struggle is difficult, and each person shrouded in loneliness, none of us are alone. It's not a battle of whose journey is the hardest, not a competition of whose scar runs the deepest, or whose sky has the most clouds. It is instead a relentless fight against a common enemy, a revolution against the abuse and the people who take advantage of the children they are trusted with. We as youth are not looking for your sympathy, instead empathy. Do not pity the child who has grown up with thick skin, but instead help her to ensure that no other child will be forced to grow up way too fast the way she was forced to. A Native American proverb states, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." Let us make it a world that we are proud to hand over, a world they will not want to give back. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll have a look at the stats. So let's Sorry, now will I just kind of increase the size? So this is what I found when I went looking at the prevalence of adolescent sexual harassment, and I'm talking peer-on-peer abuse. Obviously, there are instances of child sexual abuse in there as well. And this was within a 12-month period. So 42% of the adolescents said that the most common occurrence of sexual harassment happened online. 23% said it was most commonly experienced in the company of friends. 12% reported that school was the most common location. And 10%, aged 13 to 17, said that sexual harassment happens in pubs and clubs. And another 10% said it was in parks, towns, festivals. And, you know, when we look at the figure of school, you know, I think you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, because adolescents spend an awful lot of their time with their friends in school. So for me, when I'm looking at the figures of in school, I'm also combining them with what's happening when they're with their friends and with their peer groups. So the levels of sexual harassment, and this really, really shocked me. So I asked them to rate their experiences of sexual harassment. Now, bear in mind, this was going in an academic piece of work, so I had to be careful of how I worded it. But basically, I had 90.9% of adolescents say that they hadn't experienced any sexual harassment. The rest is shocking. So even in thinking of that, like, there's 81.8% of adolescents that have experienced some form of sexual harassment. Nearly 30% have experienced, and these are experiences within a year that they didn't want. They're not just things, laughing and jokes that they actually were quite happy to participate in. So we have 30% saying that they were experienced sexual jokes and sexual comments. Sexting and seeing images, and we all know what, you know, the prevalence of that at the moment. But we had another 26.4% that said that they had experienced being presented with images or being sent images that they didn't want to see. And we're up at the serious end of things, so physical behaviour, including sexual advances, touching, and various forms of assault. And these are all reported incidences of serious assault. And we've got 20.4%. And extreme sexual harassment, the only real way to describe that is that they experienced rape. And some of them quite brutal rape. So, adolescents reported experiencing high levels of sexual harassment within their school communities, with 63% disclosing they were subjected to somebody making unwanted sexual jokes or gestures about them in the last year. 39% of participants reported witnessing incidents of sexual harassment involving their peers within the last year. And 15% said that they had personal experiences of peer sexual harassment while in school in the last year. 23% of the adolescents felt that sexual harassment in school is common and often overlooked and not adequately disciplined. 47% stated that they would not know how to report sexual harassment in school if they were exposed to it. And 63% of adolescents didn't know if their school even had a sexual harassment policy. And this is a major problem that we have. So we have anti-bullying legislation, and sexual harassment slips in nicely there under it, and the legislation really isn't fit for purpose. 36% of adolescents reported receiving no formal education pertaining to sexual harassment while at school. So the adolescents were quite clearly telling me, look, we're lucky if we get one day, and we might talk about the birds and the bees and how you get pregnant and how to stay safe. But depending on the ethos of the school you're in, we're really lucky if we get anything more than that. And they actually want more. So 65% of adolescents reference the need for comprehensive sexual education in schools. And I also asked them, on top of what they'd experienced, what had they witnessed? And the figures are shockingly similar to the other figures that I've just shown you. In fact, they were slightly higher. So 5% of adolescents are telling me that they have witnessed other children being raped, extreme sexual harassment. Only 17.4% are saying that they've never witnessed sexual harassment. We've got another 25% saying that they've witnessed others being exposed to sexual comments and jokes. Sexting and sending images were up at 30%, and the physical behaviour, which can only be categorised as forms of serious sexual abuse, is up at 23%. And, you know, I got thinking about how are we going to tackle this? How do we look at this problem and what do we do? So obviously, as part of a PhD, you start looking at literature and what is the literature telling you. And obviously, I reviewed quite a substantial amount of it. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with a gentleman called Bromford and Brenner, but he presents an ecological systems theory. And this theory basically says that nobody operates in isolation, and that the individual, the adolescent at the start, at the middle of any system, is influenced and influences all the other systems that they come into contact with. So you've got the interpersonal level. Within that, you've got, well, you can see from the diagram, basically the adolescent, the individual, we have the parents, the family, and the home. At the interpersonal level, the things that most influence an adolescent's behavior are their peer groups, school, and social media. Then we have the community level, or the ecosystem, and then you've got social media, sexual content, pornography, substance misuse, family. All of these things have a bidirectional influence. And then at a societal level, the main factor that influences adolescent behavior are societal norms. And I believe that societal norms and bringing some sort of awareness to the impact of social norms and how they lead to gender inequality is the only way that we're going to broaden the conversation on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence and try and address tackling it. So, as I said earlier, nobody just becomes an adult and starts to sexually harass somebody else. And it is a continuum. So sexual harassment isn't a behavior that comes out of any place, no more than rape or murder. So Moffat suggests that sexual harassment exists on a continuum and needs to be viewed in this way, that all adolescent violence starts somewhere with milder forms of harassment before progressing to more serious forms of behavior. And only by understanding that concept can we address sexual harassment with a bottom-up approach. And he's not the only one that says that. If you look at the end of the ecological model that I presented, I looked at information and ecological models presented by Macmillan in NUI for consent. The World Health Organization have risk factors for experiencing and being exposed to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Jessica Taylor talks about victim blaming, or Jessica E. They all present these findings on an ecological framework. And I'm going to show you one of those frameworks now in a second. And again, Campbell as well. So there's an awful lot of literature out there. And I suppose, you know, I'm hoping that by highlighting what's happening and by backing it up with research, that we'll be able to get policy and practice that adequately addresses the problems that we're experiencing. So 36% or 39% of the adolescents interviewed reported witnessing mild to extreme sexual harassment. So this is one of the comments, one of the many, many quotes that I got from the adolescents that we spoke to. I've witnessed it. We were all friends, and there were people that we didn't know there. And there was this one girl who people thought she was drunk, and we were all in a room, and then they were like, oh, let's get her. Let's get her. She's easy because she's gone. And we were like, do you realize there are sober people here? And they grabbed her onto the bed and she was saying no and stop. And we were like, what are you doing? She clearly doesn't want it. You can't force yourself on a girl. It can't happen. It happened again because they weren't listening, and we had to take her outside. So we were outside until 2 o'clock in the morning waiting for them to leave. And this was a 16-year-old girl. I had actually one young adolescent male that said to me, we actually go to parties and we look for the drunkest person and we see where we go from there. That's shocking. So what are the risk factors of being subjected to sexual harassment? Females, funnily enough, are 2.11 to 2.11 times more likely than males to experience unwanted sexual comments. Girls are 1.5 times more likely to agree that sexual harassment occurs within their groups. It's just like it. It's just that way. You can be standing there talking to your friends and some guy will come over and grab you or do whatever he likes. You just have to push them off. So it's kind of accepted. That's just what boys do. Like, it's hard because no one's going to do anything. It happens to everyone at least once. Again, LGBTQ adolescents were nearly 3 times more likely to report that they'd experienced unwelcome sexual comments compared to straight adolescents. And adolescents who identified as LGBTQ were 2.73 times more likely to respond than respondents who identified as straight to agree that sexual harassment occurs. Older adolescents as well. So I split the adolescents within the study into younger, the 13 to 15 age group, and the 16 to 17. And by the time you hit 16, you're nearly 2 times more likely than a 13 to a 15-year-old to experience sexual harassment. Several adolescents discuss feeling that the issue of sexual harassment is not understood and is ignored within society. Additionally, they felt their only option on this subject, that their opinions on this subject were not looked for or valued. It's always other causes. You never hear anybody coming up to our age group and looking for our opinion on what you're doing right now. I just really appreciate it. What you're doing. I just wanted to say that. And I've actually found that quite shocking, that adolescents were writing thank you and we so appreciate this on the end of surveys, that nobody was listening or taking notice of what they were experiencing. So, what's the common denominator in all of this? And for me, societal norms, it's culture. It's our language, communication, courtesies, rituals, roles, customs, the relationships, the practices, the expected behaviours, the values and the thoughts. And this is one of those ecological frameworks that I reviewed. And the bottom half of the ecological framework looks at what is needed to avoid sexual harassment and gender inequality, while the top shows the imbalance of power that actually facilitates it. So as you'll see, at a societal level, we have impunitive decision-making, little funding, discriminatory laws and practices, deprioritization of violence against women, and lack of political will to do anything. And you can see on the bottom of the ecological framework, the things that we need to do, the things we need to put in place. Public opinion campaigns, supportive infrastructure, legal and policy reform, funding, advocacy. The same at the community level. We've got health, law and security not responding, inequitable norms and practices, religious and cultural justifications, acceptance of men's control. We need community outreach, movement building, skills building, enabling environment, collective action, popular education. And on it goes. At an interpersonal level, we have stigma, shame, and silence. Internalized acceptance of male superiority and female inferiority. Explicit support of violence against women. And then at an individual level, we have men's use of violence against women and girls and victims bearing the cost. And we really, really need to do something about this. And it's no point in putting stuff in place to handle what's happened afterwards if we don't address what's happening within our schools, within our homes, within our education. Consent is one issue. And why consent is so important is lack of consent contributes to sexual violence and trauma. And that leads to the things that we're working with every day of the week in RCNI and all the rape crisis centres throughout the country. It's got long life-limiting consequences, physical, emotional, sexual, short-term, and educational. It actually impacts every area of your life and your ability to succeed. So what I've done is I've developed a two-part framework. The first part of the framework looks at what's happening, how can we understand what's happening that's contributing and reinforcing gender inequality, social norms, and sexual violence and domestic violence. And the second part of my framework looks at what we need to do to respond to adolescent sexual harassment at each levels of the ecological system so that we can bring about change. So I thank you very much. I'll be sending the slides on to Mary, and anybody that wants to take a closer look at them or come back to me, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Yes, some shocking statistics there. Yeah. In a way, I noticed that 63% of your respondents said they experienced sexual harassment, and I imagine because of our culture, that could be even higher if you recognise what sexual harassment actually is. And I think so, yeah.
An awful lot of adolescents didn't actually realise what they were being exposed to. I suppose, like what Luke was saying earlier, you're so conditioned, you don't see it.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose I'm the parent of a 13-year-old, so you know, I've a renewed interest, I suppose, in the area. You get through it and you might put it behind you, but I think it's a fact of life for girls and many young boys as well from the age of 12 up, and it's very interesting to see the extra factors, then vulnerability factors for the LGBTQ community. But I suppose it's fantastic to have your research, and all we can do is learn from the research and hope that through that learning that we can bring about change. So I really look forward to hearing some practical steps that you would encourage us, you know, to follow through, and maybe we can do that, and as part of our Limerick network we can do that and bring it wider again. So thanks very much, Michelle, and we might hear from you again.
Thank you.
So I will carry on now and introduce you to Lisa Marmion. And as I said earlier, thank you, Lisa, so much for coming in at short notice. Lisa is Services Development Manager with Safe Ireland, and she brings a wealth of experience and knowledge of domestic violence, supporting victims of domestic violence and delivering strategic services in County Louth, working with Women's Aid in Dundalk for 17 years, and most recently as Services Manager for the past 6 years. Prior to that, having worked with Youth Work Ireland as Peer Education and Youth Development Officer. Lisa holds a Bachelor of Science in Social Psychology from Ulster University Coleraine and a Master's in Applied Psychology from Ulster University, and is currently completing a PhD with Trinity College, Dublin, entitled Multiple Perspectives on Father Engagement in the Context of Domestic Violence. And Lisa has a certificate in homeless prevention and intervention from Dublin City University and VTech Level 5 in Community Addiction Studies. And Lisa lectures part-time in Dundalk Institute of Technology on the Certificate in Fundamentals in Responding to Domestic Abuse. So thank you, Lisa, for bringing all that knowledge and experience to the table today, and really look forward to hearing from you. So I'm hoping I haven't talked Lisa up too much there, that she has disappeared on me.
Oh,
you're back again.
Yeah, apology. I just moved because, you know, as timing would be, unfortunately, the internet just decided to act up. So as Mary had introduced there, unfortunately, Mary McDermott, our CEO, couldn't be here with you. She really wanted to be here today, but she was unavoidably couldn't. So apologies in advance. You have me for this afternoon, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about an issue that, as so many of you are so passionate about. I'm going to focus a little bit on unpacking the experience of coercive control. I'm going to start with looking at the prevalence in an Irish context, and then we're going to together look at the journey from freedom to entrapment and what we need to do to support those who are experiencing this journey from entrapment back to freedom. So I have prepared a few slides to support. As Mary had introduced me with a lot of detail that I probably wouldn't have offered, but yes, it has been my privilege to work with women and children directly for 17 years. And so the experience of coercive control made absolute sense when it came in as an offence in the Domestic Violence Act 2018, because it's something that those of us who have worked in the area were all too familiar with. Um, the hidden in plain sight nature of this experience, where traditionally people look for this experience with their eyes only. So they look for injury, they look for bruising, all of those things. Whereas we knew that there was so much more, so much that entrapped them. So I'm going to hope my technology doesn't let me down and share a screen. So I am delighted to be here today and in such great company as well. I feel very privileged to be sharing a screen with the wonderful speakers. So just to give us really an introduction there, women aged 15 to 44 are more at risk from rape and domestic violence than from cancer, accidents, war and malaria combined. So just a little look at the Fundamental Rights Agency data that was conducted in between 2012 2014 that helped us to understand that 1 in 3 women in Ireland have experienced psychological abuse from a male partner since they were 15. 1 in 4 have experienced controlling behaviour by a male partner since they were 15. And 1 in 4 women have experienced physical and sexual abuse from a male partner or non-partner since the age of 15. So that's a huge amount of people that are living with this among us all the time, often unknown. So in Ireland, that means that nearly 500,000 women have experienced some form of psychological abuse perpetrated by a partner. 14% of women in Ireland have experienced physical violence by a partner. And so that equates to over 212,000 women aged between 20 and 75. When COVID arrived, we were very clear that this experience hasn't created COVID, the shadow pandemic hasn't created this experience. It has really exposed it. It has become more part of our conversations. It's never had the profile that it has had in the last 15 months, which of course is very welcome, because the more that we speak about it, the more that we're aware about it, the more likely we are to recognise it and to respond to it with confidence. So just to give you a sense of, and this is drawn from our member services during the time period from March towards the end of the year. So just to give you a sense, from March to December, almost 6,000 women and over 1,000 children contacted a domestic violence service for the first time. So on average, that was 2,000 women and 500 children receiving support from their local domestic violence service every month. And over 57,000 helpline calls were answered. So that's roughly about 190 calls a day throughout Ireland. Almost 2,200 requests for refuge could not be met as there was no available space. And again, that's roughly about 8 requests per day. So giving you a little sense of, the prevalence of this in Ireland, I'm very conscious and I need to draw to your attention that a significant percentage of those living with this will never contact or report their experience. So we are working with the tip of the iceberg of those who are living with this quietly. So when we think about coercive control, Evan Stark speaks about the 4 major tactics. And, physical abuse is something that, we're so used to hearing about and looking for, how it's portrayed in the media, how a lot of people still understand this experience. But when we think about the broader frame of coercive control, which, in my opinion, more accurately captures the entirety of this experience, it may or may not be physical and or sexual violence, but it will be accompanied by interweaving tactics as that are as deeply impacting for those who are living with this. So those include intimidation, stalking, degradation, control, and isolation. You know, I would have seen from practice where people are gradually isolated from family and friends. And, you know, what makes sense there is when you don't have people to share the experience with, when you don't have people to challenge that with you, um, as Luke had said earlier, you know, people can become their own prison guards there because it becomes their normality. So those interweaving tactics create the entirety of the experience of coercive control. So when we think of coercive behaviour, we think of an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, intimidation, or other abuse. And importantly, the motivation, it's used to harm, punish, or frighten the victim. The example that Luke gave earlier about, you know, not having a bruise, you know, because they're never needed to, you know, they're never needed to be bruising. So really importantly to look at how those non-physical tactics can coerce people, control their behavior, entrap them in an abusive relationship. So when we think about controlling behavior, we think about a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate or dependent. And these can include isolating them from, you know, our sources of support, our friends, our family, exploiting our resources and capacities for personal gain. And I know Luke spoke about their experiences and the real personal experience of managing, controlling all the finances, you know, making sure that people don't have access to the resources that they need, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance, and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. If we talk about the micro regulation of everything, if it's important to you, it can be regulated, it can be controlled. Anything and everything from what you wear, who you see, how you progress in your career, whether you choose to have children or not, all of these things can be controlled. So further to that, then, you know, we would consider this a crime of liberty. And I know Luke also referenced about the asking people of, you know, about what they were prevented from doing. So it is known to involve a range of tactics intended to intimidate, humiliate, degrade, exploit, isolate, and control. So, you know, in terms of like a soundbite definition, making somebody's world smaller. Um, that for me was really, really helpful in understanding what this truly does to somebody who's living with this. So the type of tactics also can include verbal, emotional, psychological abuse, the control of time, space, movement, continual monitoring, stalking, physical abuse, intimidation, threats of violence against the victim or survivor. Beyond that, threats to their loved ones, their property, their pets, rape, sexual coercion, control of pregnancy, financial abuse, the denial of resources, isolation from social, you know, sources of support. I mean, the list is exhaustive. There are so many ways, unfortunately, while having the privilege of working with women and children, there are so many ways that I've seen that they can be controlled. And, you know, we always need to be very conscious as well that children can be enrolled in these coercive behaviours, you know, being part of monitoring time, being part of reporting back, being part of relaying messages, threats. So it is something that affects the wider adults and children in that context. So the journey from freedom to entrapment, it's not immediate. From experience with those that I've worked with, it can be a gradual journey. Now, as crude and all as this example is, I find it actually useful around the boiling frog, where the thinking is that if you put a frog into boiling water, it will jump out immediately. But if you were to put a frog into cold water and raise it by degree, by degree, by degree, the thinking is that that frog will boil in that water. So, similarly, the experience, the raising of degree by degree, before you know it, this is normalized, this is part of your everyday. And, when you've got other tactics that are in there, manipulation, degradation, gaslighting, love bombing, under the guise of jealousy, the threats that are there, the financial abuse, blackmail, all of that combined can really entrap people. It can keep them exactly where they are, where they're wanted to be by the perpetrator of abuse. If we look at the work of Albert Biderman, so as far back as 1956, he developed a framework to capture the journey of prisoners of war. And it's awful how much of this framework is applicable in this situation. So the exhaustion. I've worked with women where they've been kept up all night, where they've kept, completely having to report on what they're doing. Like physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted, psychologically exhausted, financially exhausted. So there are so many ways in which people are exhausted. Threats, subtle, not so subtle. I'm going to tell social work on you. I'm going to report you to social welfare. I'm going to take the children. I'm going to leave. You're never going to see them again. I mean, you name it, it can be used as a threat. The humiliation, the constant humiliation, the degradation that goes with that. People feeling that they're not worthy. And they've been told that, they're an awful parent, a terrible wife, a terrible girlfriend. Nobody will ever love them. All of those things that are indeed controlling and distorting the perception, the gaslighting, making people believe that what happened actually didn't happen, or what didn't happen did happen. So there's ways in which people shape that kind of messaging to gaslight people that, before they know it, they themselves are deadening their own perceptions, demonstrating superiority or power. Now, people automatically go to the physical sense in that, not necessarily. I mean, an example there that Luke gave around controlling of the finance, keeping control over every aspect of what you spend, what you don't spend, what you earn, what you have access to. That is a continuous demonstration of the superiority, the power, the enforcing of trivial demands. This one, it's shocking how many people have been subjected to the enforcing of trivial demands. I want everything organized by color. I want everything organized by size. I want dinner at 1 o'clock, not a minute past, not a minute to. Things that actually don't matter a huge amount, but they are elevated as really important. And then, of course, you've got the occasional indulgences. And oftentimes that's what people, keep people hopeful, where people often want the abuse to stop, but they don't necessarily want the relationship to stop. And by occasionally indulging somebody, it keeps them hopeful. It sometimes keeps them, it further entraps them in the sense that, this may change over time. That in combination with everything else that they're experiencing ensures that they are fully entrapped. So I'm just going to play a very, it's a 1 minute long video, and I'd like you to think about some of the tactics that are used and what you can see there. And that was something that we produced earlier on in the year with Her Story. So I'm just going to play it.
My love. Words fail me. I long to hold you tight and have you to myself. You're my first thought in the morning, and I need you more than life. You belong to me and take my pain away. In your eyes, I see my soul reflected. My heart beats fast, a madness, an obsession. I'm addicted. I wish you loved yourself as much as I do. And your flaws make me love you more. I'll never let you go. Mine forever. P.S. I think you're beautiful.
So you can see from that video, gives you a small insight into the lived experience for so many people, where you don't obviously see physical abuse there, but the ways in which that woman and her child are controlled, and crucially the outside perception, that kind of attentive lovingness that's there, is just all too common in this experience. And it means then that people from the outside don't often see what this experience is. So when we think about the journey then from entrapment, where somebody's world is made smaller, to freedom, we need to be mindful of the space for action that people are so often denied, and about making that world smaller for people. It's such a great opportunity to be working with women and children on their journey. So I think that is very much my input for this afternoon. It is, just a brief unpacking of coercive control. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to stay on for any questions that you may have.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Yeah, really interesting. I think it just sits so well with what Luke had to say earlier. It shows that it's not a singular experience, unfortunately. And I suppose the questions are what we can all do, I suppose, to recognise and not let what might seem small instances pass, to support people in the early stages. And I suppose so women and girls know the danger signs maybe to look out for. That example of the frog in the cold water and then it's too late, or it's too difficult, is maybe never too late. So thank you for that, Lisa, and thanks for staying on. We might speak with you again at the end. So now I'm delighted to introduce Inspector Marion Cusack. Marion, thanks so much for coming this afternoon. It's just so important, I think, that you're here at the end of the session to show the support, I suppose, that there is there in terms of justice and from the Gardaí, and that backup is there for women and holding perpetrators accountable. So just to, Marion has over 27 years service with An Garda Síochána, starting as community guard in the Bridewell in Dublin. Further to this, Marion worked with both the North Central Drug Unit and the Garda National Drug Unit, and worked in Operation Trace for 4 years, which reviewed the cases of 6 missing women in the Leinster area. Marion then moved on to the Garda College as an instructor, while there promoted to sergeant, and was attached to the crime training faculty, where she was mainly involved in delivering training to detectives. So in 2018, we were lucky to have Marion moving to our area, where she was transferred to Henry Street as inspector, and in March 2020 took over responsibility for the Limerick Division of Protective Services Unit. And as part of this unit, Marion has responsibility for the management of sex offenders, Garda Tusla Office, Garda Victim Liaison Office, domestic violence, specialist victim interviewers, domestic violence liaison officers, and an investigation team of 2 detective sergeants and 12 detective Gardaí. So that's some responsibility. So thank you very much, Marion, for taking time out and for being here with us this afternoon.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me. And I'm delighted to be here, Mary, and to get the opportunity to talk to you all and to follow the other speakers is really, it's what they have to say is very interesting to us as police officers, and they give us a great insight into the areas of domestic violence and coercive control, and help us to understand psychologically what the victims are going through, and to understand the trauma bonding that exists there between the victims and the perpetrators. And I'm really interested to see the video that Lisa just showed there, and well done to Safe Ireland, because I think that really demonstrates, sometimes I feel even the words coercive control when they are aimed at women who are in these situations, and women who have been described that are beaten down, beaten into the ground and beaten down psychologically. The words don't mean anything to them because that behaviour is so normalised to them, you know. So it's great to see a video like that, I think, that reaches out and makes it really clear to everybody what exactly is happening. So my role, as you've described it there, I'm attached to the Protective Services Unit here in Henry Street, and part of my remit is to ensure that the domestic violence legislation throughout the Limerick division is adhered to and is enforced, and the policies and the procedures that go with that. And I also have responsibility for the Garda Victim Liaisons Office, and that works hand in hand with the domestic violence portfolio. And I suppose my objective today is to give you an overview really of what a victim of domestic violence can expect when she makes a call. And most of the time it's females that we're dealing with who make the calls for help to An Garda Síochána, but more specifically in Limerick and the measures that we have put in place in Limerick. So I suppose generally when we get a call in relation to domestic violence, we get a call, a 999 call or a call to the station. And that call is treated as a priority 1 call. So the Chief Superintendent in the communications room for the Dublin region is Chief Superintendent Laura Mangan. Changed the priority of domestic violence calls to priority 1 calls. And those calls indicate to us that there's a risk to life. So they're treated as number 1, they get an urgent response and a rapid response. And the only time that the response will be delayed is whereby the car is at another priority 1 call. But it ensures that that rapid response is provided. So what happens when the car crew goes to a domestic violence call? And I suppose sometimes the public have the perception that domestic violence calls are all made, you know, by women screaming into a phone for help from the guards, trying to protect themselves and their children from an abusive husband or partner. But realistically, there's a whole spectrum of domestic violence calls that we attend. Some are low risk, some are medium risk, some are high risk. So the car will attend and they'll deal with what they're presented with at the call. And part of what they do is, one aspect of it is if there is an arrest that can be made. So if there is evidence of a breach of an order, an assault that has taken place, or criminal damage, or public order offence if it's outside of the house, an arrest can be made, an arrest is to be made. There's an obligation on the members there to check on any children that are present in the house and to do a two-step referral if there are. And then they link in then with the victim and the complainant. Now, sometimes the victim won't make a complaint to the Gardaí, and they want the guards to attend and they want them to diffuse the situation, but they don't want to follow on with the complaint. But the guards engage with them and they tell them about the support services that are available, and they tell them about the court orders that are available to them. Now, traditionally, the guards have a responsibility within 7 days, it's part of our policy, that they link back in with those victims by phone or in person, and that they reiterate what they have told them at the scene. Last year, as a response to COVID and the added pressures that COVID was putting on the vulnerability and the vulnerable victims of domestic violence, Operation Coercive was introduced by the organisation. So Operation Coercive, there's 2 strands to it really. It's run primarily from the victim's office in each division. And a lot of the attendees today might be aware of Natasha Walsh. She's the guard here in the victim's office in Limerick and the good work that she does. Previous to Operation Coercive, Natasha would always run the reports for 24 hours and identify the domestic violence calls that were made in the Limerick area and make me aware of them. Operation Coercive has done that throughout the country, and a call is now being made to follow up from the victim's office by the liaison officer to the victim at a time when it is safe for the victim to talk. And I think that's really important, because you can imagine when you go to the call and at the scene, emotions are very high. You have actual hurt, trauma, psychological hurt, temper, tension. So it's very, very difficult for a victim to take on board the information that they're being given at the scene by the member. Whereas when they ring Natasha here, she has time to have a chat with them, to have a conversation, to talk them through the supports that are available, and to talk them through how they can get a court order or go about getting a court order for protection. The other strand of Operation Coercive is to double down on the pro-arrest policy and to make sure that the arrests are being made. Now, when those calls come into the station, a pulse incident is generated for the investigating member. But the superintendent, every morning in each district headquarters, runs a morning meeting where they look back over the incidents that have occurred the night before, or in the previous 24 hours, sorry. And him and his staff pay particular attention to the domestic violence incidents or incidents like assaults that may be categorised as domestic violence incidents, and ensure that they are categorised properly, and that if they meet the threshold for domestic violence, then that the supports kick in, and that the member has to employ those and make sure that those supports are made available. And we've put extra governance around that here in the Limerick division to ensure that no member can close down their investigation screens until the particular questions are answered in relation to domestic violence, and that the supports are being provided. Here in Limerick, I suppose we went a little step further. We wanted to see what could we do to really reach out to the victims, the high-risk victims that we have identified within the division. Now, we don't have a risk matrix available to us in the organisation to identify high-risk victims, but we're aware, and you are aware, that any domestic violence incident has the potential to become a domestic violence homicide. So we looked at the high-risk indicators that are available there, and they would be separation, strangulation, pregnancy. Some of them have been described there earlier on. And a bit of common sense, where we see that the violence that's been perpetrated against somebody, is extreme, and look at the situations that the victims find themselves living in, like isolation and what's been described previously. So we wanted to find a way to reach out to those victims, bearing in mind that the most important thing for us is the safety of those victims and maintaining the safety of those victims at all times. So we put together a team here. So you'll know some of the team, some of the attendees will know some of the team. So Natasha, as I've outlined, Louise English is a sergeant here, and she's the TUSA liaison sergeant for the Limerick division. And Jerry Staunton is one of the detective sergeants who's attached here to the Protective Services unit with me. And what we do is Natasha brings to our attention the incidents of domestic violence that we believe fit that criteria that we have looked at and set out. We identified two members who work on the regular unit here. So we started off with Garda Conor Hines and with Garda Aoife Keane. And I wanted highly motivated members who are committed to providing that service to the victims of domestic violence. And I wanted members who have very good interpersonal skills, who would try to build rapport and establish a line of communication with these victims. So we provided a little bit of training to them ourselves here. My background is in investigative interviewing. So I delivered training previously in rapport building, communication skills, eliciting and account question types. Natasha did a little bit of training with them, CPD did it here, and then we asked Adapt House to assist us. And Adapt House have provided training in relation to domestic violence, coercive control, and trauma bonding. And the trauma bonding is very important for us to get our heads around and to understand as investigators and as a police force. We have to understand why women call and call and call again, but don't move on and don't leave that partner. And the support that we've gotten from Adapt House to date has been absolutely incredible, and we're very thankful for it. And not only have they trained the domestic violence liaison officers, they've actually delivered training at this point to most of the protective service units in the Southern Division. We brought the idea to our Chief Superintendent, Jerry Roach, who was very supportive of the idea at the time. And we decided that the project would run, we called it Operation Saoilse, and we decided that it would run on a 6-month basis here in the Limerick Division. in the Henry Street district. So we have the 2 domestic violence liaison officers, 2 days a roster, 2 days a month in effect, who will go out and try and make a very safe approach to the women that we have identified as being at high risk. So if I can give you an example of one of the first ladies that we were very concerned about and how we made that approach. And as I say, the safety of these women is what's paramount for us at all times. We don't want to re-victimize them. We don't want to put them in any danger. So we were aware last year that a lady had presented at the hospital in Limerick here with very serious injuries to her back and her lungs, consistent with somebody kicking or jumping on her back. She refused to engage with the guards at the time. She refused to make a complaint. So we looked at it and we carried out very discreet inquiries, and we ascertained that this woman is basically housebound and that she lives in the house with her husband. So we took it a step further and we ascertained that he would leave the house to collect his social welfare on a particular day, at a particular time, at a particular location. And then we used the resources that are available to us to ensure that he had left and that he wasn't going to return for a period of time, and that it was safe to make the approach. And we went, the liaison officers work in plain clothes, they work in an unmarked car, and they have official mobiles and laptops and everything that they need to do their job properly. And they called to her house and explained who they were and asked would she be interested in talking to us. And she was, and she invited them in, and they went in, they sat down, they had a cup of tea with her, and they've had several interactions with her since last December. We don't measure the success of Operation Sawaja on the charge sheets that we have or on the court orders that are obtained. We measure it on the communication and the interaction from the victims with the domestic violence liaison officers. So we started back last December. We supported Adapt House in the 16 days of action. We lit up the front of Henry Street Garda Station here in Purple, and we kicked off our pilot for the 6 months. Before we did that, I had a briefing with all of the units here, the operational units here, and I told them what we were doing, why we were doing it, and what we were trying to achieve, and that it's outside of talking about orders and it's outside talking about legislation. This is about us meeting very vulnerable women and saying to them, we're the police. We can recognise that you mightn't be in a place yet where you can avail of the help that we're willing to give you, but we're here, and we acknowledge that maybe you've called us several times, but the time isn't right for you yet. But we're here to help, and we will help you in any way that we can. And for example, last Tuesday, the patrol car was called to a domestic incident. They went up. The victim told them that she didn't want to make an official complaint, but she whispered to one of the members, I'm terrified of him, I'm terrified of him. Now, he's her ex-partner, and it would appear that he is controlling her. There's coercive control from outside of the relationship. Those members came back here to Henry Street. They contacted Louise, they contacted Natasha. They told them about the concerns that they had for her. They contacted me. So Kim and Connor weren't working on Operation Sawaja days last week. They were contacted. They made a phone call with her. And by the time the superintendent actually heard about the report in the afternoon and contacted me, they had made an arrangement to meet that woman the following day. So they met her, sat down, had a cup of tea with her, talked her through what they could do with her. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, they were in the family law court with her to get the order, to get her protection or safety order. And she has now decided that she's in a place where she can come in this week and make the complaint, an official complaint in relation to coercive control. So we had another example. We had a very, very serious incident a couple of weeks ago where a woman in her own home suffered horrific long-term injuries. And when we did the report on that report actually got escalated up to the Deputy Commissioner of An Garda Síochána, who is Anne-Marie McMahon, who served here previously in the Limerick Division. And she has made contact with me and several occasions at this point to check in on how that victim is recovering and to ensure that the support services are being made available on our behalf to her, to the victim, you know, to ensure that we can do everything that we can do. So what I'm trying to do is show you that there is a huge commitment, not just here locally, but throughout the organisation, you know, towards the victims. And I think there's positive steps are being taken and there is a recognition there, and we're trying to do better. You know, our chief superintendent here has given an undertaking that Operation Saoilse will be put on a more permanent footing, and we're moving towards that at the moment and going through sorting out our logistics to make sure that that can be achieved. And what Operation Saoilse has done, I suppose, is given us a platform. We have a lot of interaction with the different support agencies, with the hospital, the maternity hospital, with Adapt House, whereby people there are becoming very familiar with us, with the domestic violence liaison officers and with the service that they're getting. And they're not afraid to phone us, and they know to phone us, and they know that we're interested in providing assistance to them and that we will respond. And I'd like to take that opportunity today to get that message out there that a lot of you already know Jerry Staunton or Natasha or maybe myself, and you've met the two liaison officers, but you can make contact with us here. If there's somebody that you're concerned about within your own organisation, if there's somebody that you're concerned about that you're dealing with through your agencies, and you'd like us to come and have a chat, or you'd like a little bit of advice, or make that contact with us, we're willing to engage and we're looking forward to it. Basically, I think that's what I have to say today. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Marion. And just to thank, I mean, An Garda Síochána have been such committed members of the Limerick Network on Violence Against Women from the outset, and obviously you play such a key role. But I suppose what strikes me from what you have to say is it's not easy to keep women safe, and the strategic approach and so many layers that you have to put in place to try to keep women safe. And also that now you are measuring success, but that doesn't have to be dependent on convictions or orders, that it can be on interactions. Because I think in every organization you have to have your stats to prove you're succeeding, but that's not the reality really.
No,
You know?
and just to reiterate that what we have found with coercive control, it's been highlighted here time and time again today. So some cases are very straightforward, and the women have the knowledge, they realise what's happening to them, they can see exactly what's happening to them. But you take a woman who's in a controlling relationship over 20 years and has to, as Luke has outlined, self-regulate her own behaviour and control herself to avoid the conflict. When it comes to situations like that, we can find it difficult to elicit evidence from those women to support the coercive control charges, you know, to get the evidence that we need to support the charges. But we're willing to work with the different support agencies who may have knowledge in relation to the woman's history and her past to try and build those cases where we can, you know. And as you say, it's not easy. These are complex cases. There's a lot, you know, but the willingness is there. That's the message, really.
Yeah, thank you, Marion.
Thanks.
I'd like to bring back in the rest of the panelists now at this stage, and we'll open up for some questions that have come in. Okay. Okay. So can you, Lisa and Luke, Marion and Michelle, do you want to turn on your cameras? And Evie, you have, yeah, you might say, I think you're emailing me questions, but I have two here in the Q&A. So I have a question from Owen Burke. Do you think the media's reporting of domestic abuse could be a catalyst for change in public attitudes towards recognizing and reporting domestic abuse? So I'm wondering who might want to take that. Lisa or Luke? You've both referred to the media, I think.
Sure, I don't mind, Mary, if you want me to start.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, it's so important because how we understand this issue will affect directly how we respond. And where we have in the media explainers as to how the behaviour occurred, it doesn't help. It sometimes obscures the pain that people are going through. I'm a great fan of when we know better, we do better. So when we see it in its entirety and realise the devastating impact of this on women and children, you know, I do feel that will encourage people to lean in to those that are experiencing this, as opposed to dismissing it as something that happens over there.
Thank you, Lisa. I have some more questions in now. I have one for you here, Marion. Since the introduction of coercive control legislation, have there been many reports, of arrests in Limerick?
Yeah, last year there were a number of successful prosecutions taken throughout the country in relation to coercive control. We have a number of investigations that are underway at the moment. And it's like I've explained to you there about how complex these investigations are. So it's not as simple as observing a physical attack on somebody where there's a physical assault and you can make an immediate arrest. When it comes to coercive control, it's a very detailed investigation, and a statement would need to be taken where you're going back and you're trying to tease out over years precise detail that's going to support the charges, to support the legislation that we have. Now, saying that, one of the cases that has successfully gone through the courts already was actually a short-term relationship. It wasn't a very long-term relationship that had actually developed, and they got that successfully through the courts. Another one in Blanchardstown last year was a longer-term relationship that they had success with. But at the moment here in Limerick, we have numerous cases that we're investigating at the moment.
Thanks, Marion. Luke, welcome back. I know you had warned us that your connection could drop, so thanks for it. You got back in again, so that's great. Luke, I don't know if you wanted to add, I just asked the question there. Do you think the media's reporting of domestic abuse could be a catalyst for change in public attitudes towards recognising and reporting domestic abuse? And there's another one which I might tag on to that. How have the media responded to you calling out their problematic reporting of domestic violence and domestic homicide? Oh, I can see you, but I can't hear you now. Will we come back to you in a minute, Luke? Yeah, I'll come back to you. Michelle, I have a question for you. How are schools doing enough to combat sexual violence and harassment, and what can they do to make things better?
Absolutely, they're not doing enough, but it's not schools that are the problem in their entirety. It's the legislation that governs schools. So we really need a fit for purpose sexual harassment legislation for schools. I mean, schools are governed under the Employment and Equality Act. That's the same act that governs us in our workplace, and it's not fit for purpose for adolescents. So we really, really need to address that, and we need comprehensive sexual harassment education introduced at the very least in first year, right up through the curriculum. So, you know, an awful lot of work to be done there, an awful lot of recommendations that we've come on the back of my findings.
Thank you, Michelle.
No problem.
Well, Luke.
Yeah, sorry, my internet is back now, so I've joined on my computer again.
Perfect. Do you want me to go through those questions again? Or
so it was, yeah, like, could reporting make a difference if we do it properly, and how have the media responded to sort of the training? So I absolutely think that good reporting would make a huge difference, because we never recognized we were victims, because a lot of the messages that were put in front of us were really stereotypical, and they were just violence, and they were particular types of men. You know, our father was a man who was like, he was like some sort of he never lost control. He was very entitled. Everything had to be around him, but he never like lost control. It was all, there was always a reason. There was always intention, like laden in everything that he did. So we never saw our father as the kind of like mentally ill, chaotic man that comes home and beats his families at weekends. He was this like puppeteer bloke who controlled and managed our lives to minute details. And it was just like, that's not domestic abuse. That's just like some personality flaw. That's like some insecurity. That's something else, but it's not domestic abuse. And we never realized that we were in any danger. We were pretty miserable. Our lives were tiny and we couldn't do a lot. But we thought that for a man to be dangerous, he'd have to become increasingly violent, and we would have a good warning before any murder would come along, right? We thought, you know, maybe he'd slap us, then he'd beat us, then it'd get more frequent, and there'd be weapons, then you know, there'd be a long run up to getting killed. We just hadn't understood that there's different types of men who commit domestic abuse, right? There's obviously the men who are mentally ill, chaotic, and maybe they just spray chaos at everyone in every direction, right? There probably are men like that. But then there's also men who won't hit you, but they'll kill you. And they won't hit you because they're trying to keep under the radar. And they know that they lose a lot more control if they hit you than if they're smart about it. Because one, you as a victim recognize it as domestic abuse immediately. And two, you've got evidence to show other people. So if they don't hit you, you're confused and no one believes you. So you're stuck. And he was smart enough to know that and play the game. And I never thought people were intelligent domestic abusers. I didn't think you went out of your way and planned it and it was like something you put all your effort and meaning in life behind. But our father did, and his entire existence was around the level of control he had over us. And I think if we had recognized those different types of abusers, right, a much more nuanced conversation, a much more kind of deeper understanding about the fact that the danger isn't simply a function of how violent they are. It's a function of how deeply committed they are to controlling you, and that's psychological. So you have to understand the abuser's psychology to understand the risk, not their behaviors, because their behaviors might seem pretty trivial, right, and mundane, but relentless. And it's only when you understand what psychology underlies it, you understand how dangerous they are. So we just judged our father superficially, physically, because that was all that was ever put in front of us. And at no point did we understand that people like him could kill. It just didn't make any sense. We couldn't figure out a causal chain between him being mundane and controlling tiny little things in our lives to like just eliminating us. So I think if you get reporting right, victims start recognizing what's going on in front of them. I think that's the success of reporting, is that people go, I can make sense of this now and I understand what this is. We were just like, what the hell is this? This is just complicated. That was it. It's just really complicated, but there's no name for it. There's no one can help us with this. It's just a horrible, entangled mess. And I think reporting should be aiming for that, frankly. Like, we should be helping victims see what's directly in front of them. And I think that's what the function of it should be. But a lot of it is, I think, as we found to the second question, how have the media responded? A lot of the media don't understand domestic abuse, right? I mean, we lived with it for 25 years and we didn't understand it. So I can't blame them for not understanding it, because maybe they've never experienced it. But the point is, they should be making more of an effort, right? And when we went to train them, we were lucky. It's hard to train them because they're so busy, they don't pay, and there's no like incentive, right? You just have to go out of your way to give these people half an hour and then they're back off, and there's no sort of system of training around this. You have to just do it off your own back. And they found it really valuable. They were saying, you know, we didn't frame domestic abuse this way. We didn't understand the details of what was going on. We didn't see the dynamics in this way before. And they found it really, really valuable. Although, I mean, we trained the BBC, we've trained other newspapers and stuff. Then once you've trained them, you disappear and you see the same old stories come out, right? So even if you train all the editors, clearly some of them weren't listening, or they're not paying much attention or whatever. It just keeps, all the bad stuff keeps filtering through. But I think the more that we do it, the more difference it'll make. And then hopefully victims won't be as blind as we were ultimately if the media can do its job.
Thanks, Luke. I suppose it's all within the same culture, isn't it, where we don't even see the sexual harassment that you were talking about, Michelle. So I have another question here. Marion, and you know, whoever else would like to come in, it can be difficult to prove or document coercive control. What do victims need to do to prove it's happening?
So, Mary, what we would do is, and what the domestic violence liaison officers do with victims who they go out and meet. We have an app that we can download onto their phones, and the app is actually hidden behind a weather app on their phone, so it's not apparent that it's a domestic violence app. And they can log into the app and they can record different incidents that are happening to them, or different methods in which they're being controlled. And I think whatever you do, if you're conscious, and I think this is the key, it's like Luke has described there, and I've heard Luke speak previously, and I was very struck by the fact that until they sat in the police station and saw the posters, that it didn't occur to them that they were living with coercive control. And I remember 1997, 1998, going out to arrest a guy for drug trafficking, and his wife was being absolutely controlled. And we'd no language around that at the time, and we had no way to describe it. And the only way that I could describe it was that the only way she could tell what time it was what was on the television, what programs were on television during the day. She was just completely separated from reality. She was completely broken down. And I think she wasn't aware of how she was living or what was happening to her. If you're aware, then you can start to document and you can start to keep a record, be it in a notebook, be it on an app, be it so that we can build that picture and we can start to build that evidence, But to take a statement from a victim of coercive control, it takes a skilled interviewer to be able to interview somebody, because like this, you're going back over years. And the difficulty is that somebody is saying, oh, he always did. It was always that way. Sure, it was always this way. Whereas we're trying to break that down into the evidence that will help us to support those charges. And I think just when you spoke about the media there, I think Lisa's, the little film that you had there, Lisa, I think that really brings it home to us, because I'm always concerned about, the words, even coercive control, to break those down to the victims that we need, the people who are trying to get the message across to. Like Luke said, it should be, what can't you do? Tell me what you can't do, rather than how you're being controlled. I think for people to really get that message into their heads of, this is how it affects me, and this is the way that I need to be thinking,
Thanks, Marion. Lisa, a question for you. What is your opinion on the use of parental alienation? And you might explain that to me, Lisa, because I'm imagining you understand that term. This seems like something that could be quite dangerous for women in abusive situations who have children with abusive men.
Absolutely, Mary. It is an issue that's presented more and more, that I know that our colleagues in the UK are battling on this ground before us as well. It's a really difficult issue in the sense of, from our experience, women have very well grounded reasons as to wanting to protect their children in the event of access. But unfortunately, for those that allege abuse, there's an increasing pattern where they're then unfortunately accused of alienating the other parent. So it is something that I know that the Minister is certainly in the process of engaging further research in this area, and that's very, very welcome, because unfortunately it gets conflated with very real experiences for women and children. The basis of it being a quasi-scientific understanding coming out of Gardner's work in the 80s, but we would be very clear in that it doesn't apply in this context. Anyway, sorry, that's kind of a very broad. It is, it would deserve its own session, this particular issue, but for now, that's just a little insight into it.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go to one or two more questions because we're coming up to 4 o'clock. Marion, I suppose an important one for you. If I suspect a friend or family member is in an abusive relationship, what should I do? Can I contact my local Garda station for information?
So absolutely, we would And we want to encourage people to contact their local stations. If you want to contact us here, you can contact us here through the victim's office. And as I said, Natasha is inside in the victim's office, and she can bring it to my attention, and we can have the domestic violence liaison officers make contact with that person. And all these contacts will be dealt with, needless to say, confidentially. But we encourage any kind of contact, any kind of a query that you have like that. If you try to make contact with us through the victim's office, or maybe people know guards in their own local Garda stations that they can talk to, and they can talk to quietly and just get a little bit of advice about what to do. But as I've said and I've outlined, our method here with our liaison officers is to make that very soft, very gentle approach, and make it, in a confidential way, so that we're not putting those victims in danger. So if we can do that and we can help, by all means, talk to us, and we'll do what we can to help.
Thank you, Marion. Just a final one then. Free legal aid and free counselling needs to be provided by the state to domestic violence survivors. How can we progress this? I'm not sure who might want to take that. Do you agree?
I guess from my own experience, I think it was really, really helpful for Ryan getting therapy, because we're quite different. Ryan isn't someone who naturally reflects on things, so for him it was hugely powerful, and it taught him a lot. And I think without therapy, Ryan would have really, really struggled. And we were lucky just because, Ryan basically he had health insurance with work, so that covered some percentage of it, which made it much easier. I didn't really benefit from it because I'm relentlessly neurotic. Like, I think all the time and I'm always trying to understand things. So I'm not a mystery to myself. And much of what therapy was trying to do, I was like, I've been here, I can do this, and I'm okay with being in me. I just needed to understand what was going on. So I spent all my time reading books, right? Philosophy and psychology and feminism and criminology. I just needed to understand how we got to that point, and that was what really helped me. But I do think for a lot of people, therapy would be hugely important, because one of the big effects of coercive control is that, as I said, after a while you become your own prison guard, right? It doesn't just happen to you, it distorts your perception, it changes the narratives that you interpret the world through, and the eyes that you look through become the abuser's eyes, and your own will becomes the abuser's will, and you just become a means for them to get what they want. So for a lot of victims, this isn't just a trauma, they've been rewired. And actually, I think for domestic abuse and coercive control, most of all, people don't just need enlightening, they need the unwiring and rewiring, right? And that's a really, really massive deal. We developed coping mechanisms and survival techniques in it, which mean we were kind of more resilient maybe than most. But I think for a lot of people, you get so lost in that kind of environment that you need a lot more than just therapy. I think actually you need huge amounts of time. You need to disconnect. You need to just take everything apart and figure out what you've got, and then start from the very beginning. And I think we've been lucky because talking at these sort of events has helped Ryan and I process a lot, right? There's almost been like free therapy, just talking to strangers all over the place. But for a lot of people, it's just them, right? And there's no one who understands what they've been through. They don't have the community to articulate to. And I think I don't feel much hope for the government helping with that, unfortunately. But one thing I think would help, as I said, we've benefited a lot from, is these sort of communities. Like, if you can talk to other women who've been through it, if you can talk to specialists, if you can just find groups of people who actually know what domestic abuse and coercive control are, that's probably going to be the most benefit you get. And for me particularly, therapy didn't do anything. It was these kind of environments where I met a lot of people who cared, understood, and were really willing to listen. And for me, that was the most important thing. So I'd say, yeah, try and find local groups of women who can help. The government might take a while to get there, I think.
Thank you, Luke. So I know there's one or two questions, but they're mainly around local services. And I think we can get back to people individually around those questions. I just want to give a thank you to all the panelists today. I've learned so much information myself. Any of the presentations. If you share them with us, we can get them out to people. And I suppose also I want to thank all the members of the local area network around violence against women. So I know they've come into the chat, but I suppose it's a powerful network. You know, we support each other. We have the frontline services, community and voluntary organisations, statutory services, and I hope that we are a community that can make a difference to women and keep women safe. And hold perpetrators accountable. And we'll continue to run our own events and try to raise awareness ourselves, and if other people can come along with us, that's all we can do. So just want to say thank you to everybody for coming today. We had a fantastic turnout today. We had over 80 people, and anyone who joined, nobody left, so, or very few left, so that attests to you, the panelists, what you had to say. And we had people coming into this webinar from all different backgrounds, from length and breadth of Ireland and internationally as well. So thank you for coming, and I hope you learned something today. So thank you, everybody.